so much for this kind invitation and kind introduction. It's indeed good to be back here, and also to be back to a topic that has engaged me for many years. But as of recently, I am no longer doing so much teaching and talking about it. So when I was wondering, what am I going to talk about here today? I thought, well, with a physicist in the room, I better don't talk physics, but really focus on the theology. So there will be quite some theology in what I'm trying to say today, but I hope it's going to be not only for the theology professionals among you, but will be understandable also to those who have another expertise than theology. And as Alf already quoted, Augustine, Church Father Augustine, at the end of the 4th century, beginning of 5th century, said these famous words about time: when nobody asks me, I know exactly what it is, but when people start to ask me, I don't know what it is. And I think that's still in many ways valid today. In spite of the lack of the clear and definitive definition of time, theologians and scientists often treat time as if such a definition was given once and for all, while at the same time, the concept of time that a person holds due to his or her profession can be considerably different from the concept of time that the same person has in other aspects of her life or his life. So we can actually be a little bit schizophrenic about time. We can know something in our profession, but then when it comes to the personal experience and to also the personal way of handling our time, we do quite different things. Talking time, handling time, experience time is not all the same. So how then can we talk about matters of time so that time matters for us in both intellectually and spiritually healthy ways? And my main answer to that question would be that we cannot understand time adequately unless we take into account that time relates to something that is other than time. And the theological word for that other of time obviously is eternity. So in this talk I'm focusing on the theological distinctions between time and eternity. But first, before I get to the technicalities, I thought I would take you with me on a short trip, at least virtually. I would invite you to look together with me at two famous masterpieces of art, which can tell us something about the history of time meeting eternity. And our first stop is the Cathedral of Chartres in France. Maybe some of you have actually been there and seen this so-called royal doorway. It's the west door, which was built about 1150. And it's the central part which is the most interesting part. In the tympanon up there, there is this famous Majestas Domini, Christ as the eternal ruler, the one who was, who is, and who will come. And the symbols here are from the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible: the throne, the 4 creatures, the 24 elders, and the angels. And I would like you to look at some details here in these archivals. I will show you in a second that the angels in the archivals are holding this kind of thing in their hands. And this is an astrolabe, is that the right pronunciation in English? Astrolabium in Swedish. And this was used for astronomical observations, and it's also a way of keeping track of time. Now, obviously you can't keep track of seconds very easily with this. This is about big time. The vision of the royal door is about big time, aeons of time, which find their fulfillment in eternity. Now it's those angels here that keep this astrolabes in their hands. So this is a vision of eternity being the fulfillment of time. Eternal God rules over time and will eventually release creation from the constraints of perishability. So the heavenly doorway guarantees the goal and the meaning of life within time. So this vision does not, for instance, focus on an individual person's right to her lifetime or his lifetime. And it does definitely not allow for saying time is money. Because remember, this was the time when moneylenders still were supposed to go to hell directly after death. Because earning money just on time, taking rent. So earning money because time flows, so to speak, was considered stealing from God. Because time was God's. So this is eternity fulfilling time. From Chartres, let's jump almost 400 years forward into history to Nuremberg in Germany, where Albrecht Dürer had his studio. And this is one of his famous copper plates. It's called Night, Death and Devil. And it dates from 1513. And just a small caveat, my interpretation of this work of art, of course, is a rather free interpretation, and it's an interpretation done now, and not an interpretation that would have been done 1513. What we see here is a single person, the knight, who is confronted with death, but clearly willing to fight for his time, for his life. Death is holding an hourglass in his hand. And if you compare the hourglass to the astrolabe, it's sort of a different image of time. The hourglass makes intervals. It cuts, so to say, time into pieces, chunks, slices. And the horse of death has a clock around its neck, another symbol of time divided in pieces. And look at the sky. Heaven is empty. It's not the vision of eternity, fulfillment of time. Heaven is empty. Empty background for a city, which looks like a fortress on the hill in defense of time. Background for these trees and bushes, affected by what appears to be an anticipation of the ecological crisis, and background for the weapons that rule the world. And the message here could be, defend yourself against death and evil. Do not count on eternity to put it all right, but have a well-thought-out strategy here and now. And that is, put on the perfect armor and raise the visor, look straight forward, convincingly, ignore death as long as it's possible. This could be an image of time that has lost its relationship with eternity. And nowadays, eternity seems to have lost its authority as a dimension of its own dignity. So how often go you around and actually think about eternity? I don't so very often. And I think that's sort of significant of our time. From having been the obvious goal, whose authority conditions life on earth, as it was in Chartres, eternity tends to be reshaped into a dimension of maybe peace and hope, whose value is determined by its capacity of offering something here and now, some light, some comfort. So eternity has become something that is relevant only insofar as it gives us something here and now, a factor of happiness, a means of increasing quality of life here and now. Only insofar as it contributes to our well-being here and now, it is said. In Chartres, time is looked upon as a function of eternity, which in mathematical terms could be something like this. Time is a function of eternity. And now, it seems to be the other way around. Eternity has more or less become a function of time. Of course, that raises a number of questions. Is that okay? Does eternity hold any authority today? What is lost if it hasn't? Can we really understand time without taking into consideration the relationship of time to its other eternity? And that's what I'm focusing on from the point of view of theology. And when you do theology, you often start by looking at the Bible. So a quick look at the Bible. What does the Bible say about time and eternity? Well, as in many other cases, the Bible does not say just one thing. It says a number of things. And it doesn't provide us with a clear definition of what time is and what eternity is. That is not the subject. And it's also clear that in the Bible, time is predominantly understood as time for something. It's always time for something. It's content that counts, not the framework. And time and eternity are not understood as each other's opposite, but they relate to each other in different ways. Therefore, all attempts to extract a doctrine of time from the Bible is sort of biased. But that has been done, nevertheless. And there are several scholars that have defended the erratic thesis that Israel was the one and only to develop a concept of linear time, and not only having a sort of cyclical view. And in this very thesis, the underlying assumption was that linear time is superior to cyclical time. But there's one interesting narrative in the Bible where directly after the big flood, it's in Genesis chapter 8, that is according to one layer of tradition in the biblical scriptures, the so-called Yahwistic layer, God speaks in terms of cyclical time, says, as long, after the flood, as long as the earth remains, there will be springtime and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night. And directly after that, in the priestly layer of writings, God applies linear time. God makes a covenant with Noah, which is sealed by the rainbow. Now, if linear time had been hailed as the superior concept, then the editor who put these two things just side by side probably would have thrown out the cyclical one and just hailed the historic, the covenant one. But they are there, both and. And I think that's the way it actually is in our lives as well. We see both collectively, but also individually, we see the progressive line in our lives, but we are so dependent on the cycles, aren't we? The impression that different notions and experiences of time coexisted, and that was not a problem, as the main interest was not a definition, but the content of time in relation to God and eternity. This is important to notice since in the name of uniqueness and exclusivity, you know, I think that comes with doing research. You want to extract that which is unique and exclusive to something. But that has been done to understanding time and eternity in the Bible. Dualisms have been created which disqualify one half of life, so to say. Because linear time was associated with Yahweh, the one male God of history, exclusive to Israel and its purity, and in contrast to the many vegetation goddesses of the surrounding people and their syncretism. So you see how you can construct like hierarchies, the one male God, pure history, eschatology, all good things, and all less good things, cyclical, female, cycles, fertility, and all this kind of stuff. So it's good to know that this is not an either or, but actually when you look at the Bible, this goes into each other. Regarding time and eternity, we find very little strict dualisms in the Bible, rather worlds of dynamism. And I'm thinking especially the writings of the New Testament, where we meet different variations of the topic already not yet. We already know this, but it's not yet been fully revealed. This is a very dominant, a very important topic in the New Testament. So this is hardly possible to sum up, but if I would try, I would say that time has to be understood in relation to its content in the biblical sense. And it has also got to be understood in terms of relation, a certain theory of relativity, not in the Einsteinian sense, of course, but a dynamic, holistic, and relational understanding of both time and eternity, which cannot be deduced from modern physics, of course, but can be consistent with physical theories of time. So, from the Bible to theology, the most interesting question from a theological point of view then is not what is time and what is eternity, but how do they differ from each other and how do they relate? And I found like three different models. And I found there is, in theology, an ontological difference between time and eternity, there is a quantitative difference, and there is an eschatological difference. And here's where a little bit theological, technical terms come in. We find a good example of the ontological difference in Augustine, Church Father Augustine, in his book Confessions. And one of his central points is that time and eternity are essentially, ontologically different from each other. To Augustine, eternity is complete stability and total simultaneity. Time is the opposite, it's unstable. What has passed is no longer, what is coming is not yet, and it's time only insofar as it becomes a past. Time exists only, Augustine says, time exists only as the present of the past, the present of the present, and the present of the forthcoming. This means that time exists in the soul as memory, as sight, what we see, as expectation. And that brings Augustine to describing time as a distentio animi, a distension in mind, something that expands in mind. On the one hand, distension is understood in a neutral way. If something has an distensional extension, you can actually measure it. We can measure time. On the other hand, for Augustine, it also has an existential dimension. The distension in mind is also the restlessness of the mind. It's the restlessness of the disquiet mind. This is why he has this beautiful saying, our heart is restless inside us unless it comes to rest in God. So compared to eternity, time is then characterized by a deficiency. There is no temporary remedy to the flaws in time. Time can never improve by itself. All time stay at the same awful distance from eternity. Only, if I want to imagine inside, there is this time extension, and there is eternity with a total simultaneity above there somewhere, and they never really meet unless in very rare occasions, rara visio, or rare vision, Augustine says. So then you get sort of a glimpse of this eternity. I think this Augustine's take on time is sort of in harmony with what we saw in Chartres. And the strength of this concept is it's very clear. Time is created, whereas eternity is not. Time can never become everything. It always carries a longing for eternity with it. And I think that's the line with mystical experience. In mystical experience, you get this sort of discontentment with time, and you get the vision of eternity of something different. The rigid distinction between time and eternity makes it difficult, though, to motivate people to really struggle for better times. Things cannot really improve. If the only possible relation to eternity is a very rare experience by the soul, it might be hard to spell out what the consequences of this relationship to eternity entail for the body, let alone for the social body, for the relationship between human beings and the whole creation. It does not fit neatly with the dynamics and the ethical claims which are inherent, for instance, in the teaching of Jesus. What the ontological difference cannot accomplish, maybe can be accomplished by the quantitative difference. This means that the only difference between time and eternity would be in quantity. Swiss theologian Oscar Cullmann advocated this in a very influential book in the 1940s called Christ and Time. And his basic hypothesis is time is linear, nothing but linear. And also in his view, cyclical time is sort of less developed and contrary to biblical thought, which I showed you it's not. To him he said, claiming a qualitative difference, or an ontological difference, as Augustine does, that is like a Platonic rape of Judaic and Christian thinking. Instead, Cullmann thought, time is like a line that moves slowly upwards. An eternity is, in effect, nothing else than infinite time. Where time is finite, eternity is infinite, so that's the whole and only difference. Now, the advantage of this model is there isn't any dualism between time and eternity. It's easy to also motivate labor for better times and better world in order to build the kingdom of God. Pretty much like Dürer's night. One avoids also the problem of explaining how a God who is above, beyond time, could interact with time. Because everything is basically time. Because in the end, eternity is swallowed by time. Time swallows eternity. And in the end, God is nothing but a God within time, who differs from creation merely in terms of an enlarged projection. So God is this enlarged human being. This exclusivity in a linear understanding of time is not in line with the scriptures, although Kuhlmann firmly believed it. But what he did was that he identified as the biblical understanding of time, the Newtonian understanding of time. And he combined it with a significant dose of Enlightenment belief in progress. Hence he got not only a straight line, he got a straight line that's moved upwards. That was progress. And of course that's very good to meditate over, that he was so convinced that he got it right. He was not aware, obviously, that it was the Newtonian glasses that were on his nose, and that he was also entrenched in this belief in progress. So a third way of doing this would be what I call the eschatological difference. Now, eschatology is the theological term for the last things. And the last things may mean both what we think happens when the very last calendar has come to an end, so to speak. But it can also mean what is existentially the last things. And the eschatological difference, I would say, has a main focus on dynamic. It says, what happens when eternity breaks into time? What happens if we look at the future not only as an extrapolation of that which we already know, as a futurum, but if we look at the future as advent, as that which comes from the future to us. What does that mean? And theology can make sense of those questions. It's also clear that when the quantitative builds on continuity between time and eternity, so all goes on. The eschatological distinction does not presuppose infinite continuity. It builds on a daunting discontinuity instead. It conceives of time also as a manifold phenomenon and wants to know, what is it that turns time into olden time? What allows new time to intervene and interact with old times? How can it be that theology speaks of already and at the same time not yet? A famous Bible quote that appears quite often at baptisms says, we are already, on the one hand, we are already buried with Christ in order to live with him. And then on the other hand, in 1 John it says, it has not yet appeared what we are going to be. Already, not yet. In faith, we already take part in eternal life. The Gospel of John says, yet we all face death as the inevitable end of our lives. So in this dynamic eschatological model, time and eternity appear to be intertwined, yet separated, not the same. And it seems to me that this model can actually deal with a multiplicity of times. And that's what we have got to do. Not just in the Einsteinian sense of time depending on the system of reference, but also in a sense of different events having their own indwelling times, their own indwelling rhythm. According to this understanding, time is no longer a totality, like in the Newtonian worldview, but a multi-layered phenomenon. And this view fits a lot better with both the biblical sources and modern science. Now, a very short reflection actually on the way also science has developed in these periods, where the quantitative model favors continuity. The eschatological distinction focuses much more on irregularities, disturbances, and discontinuities. And in that, I think it parallels developments both in philosophy and in science. The philosophy and science of earlier modernity was interested in continuity and in linearity, expressed in the temporal sense in terms of a continuum of progress as the ideal, and in the spatial sense in terms of a colonization of the rest of the world. In contrast, the philosophy and the science of the later modernity has turned its attention to ruptures and diversity. Metaphorically speaking, where earlier modernity hoped to gain knowledge from a reality perceived as seamless, later modernity hopes to learn from scrutinizing the seams of reality, as it were. While classical physics, enchanted by the discovery of the universality of natural law, celebrated the continuity of absolute time and space, 20th century science has turned much of its interest to discontinuities, like the role of disturbances for the formation of galaxies, the part of bifurcation points in chaotic systems, processes of emergence in complex systems, and the significance of quantum leaps. In that sense, the eschatological distinction is consistent with these critical tendencies in science, philosophy, and culture more than the other two models. Checking how I'm doing in time. My conclusion on that part would be that the eschatological model is the most convincing one. And there's something more to be said about the quantitative difference, because if I'm right that time, so to speak, swallows its other, and time is all that is left, by depriving time of its relation to its other, this model actually intensifies the experience of lack of time, which seems to be a quite widespread problem these days, I think. It's not only, I said in that interview when she asked me, the journalist, what do you think about time and who is in charge of your time and so on. And I said in the end, well, what I would hope for sometimes is this just day between 2 days that is not used for anything yet. So I think this experience of when time expands to swallow eternity, the other of time, we get, in a sense, paradoxically, a lack of time. If time is all there is, you better try to hurry up so that you get most out of it. Carpe diem. And the result, I think, is a merciless demand for speedy efficacy, a culture of acceleration. We usually think when you can do the same thing a little quicker, that is better. But that contributes to a devastating incapacity to meet the strange and unknown. Because when you meet the strange and unknown, you have to slow down. And there's friction, which makes you feel that you are losing time. And you also get more difficult to engage in relationships that are slow in developing. And coming to the point as quickly as possible becomes the ideal. The strange and different appears just to be a bump in the road to be evaded. And this may contribute, at least, to the growth of xenophobia in well-to-do Western European society. Well, these were three models, and once more, the ontological model comes across as quite static and hierarchical. The quantitative model, eternity is swallowed by time, and we get this lack of time. When we hear about the quantitative model, it is more the voice of Sir Isaac Newton rather than the biblical chorus of voices. It is, quote from Newton, absolute, true and mathematical time that of itself and from its own nature flows equally without regard to anything external. The eschatological model, if you found it a little fuzzy, that's exactly right. It is a little fuzzy, but it is dynamic and relational. The fuzziness is nothing to be afraid of, I think. Somehow the principle of uncertainty in quantum physics prepares the path here. A caveat, however, I'm not suggesting that theology gets better when we apply methods in physics. Neither am I trying to use quantum physics as an excuse for relativism or an attitude of intellectual laissez-faire. Rather the opposite. What is needed is not less rationality, but more and more than rationality. By focusing on relationality, the eschatological model corresponds not only to significant developments in philosophy and science, as just mentioned, also corresponds to significant developments within theology during the last decades. And it may come as a surprise to some that theology also develops, but be sure, it does. And there are lessons to be learned for contemporary theologians as well, in particular from science. Even though science and eschatology do not look like a couple really made for each other, because eternity is not really relevant for a scientist. But, even though it's not an easy couple, eschatological thinking in theology will fare better if it takes notice of science. The general neglect of modern science in theology has contributed to flaws. And at times, theologians have shown an unfortunate tendency to use the words nature, earth, world, creation, cosmos, universe, if there were synonyms, and thus not being aware of the enormous scales of time and space that are entailed. In the ignorance of that, much of traditional eschatological thinking about the last questions, has been caught in a rather narrow anthropocentrism, caught in thinking of humans only, and also in a geocentrism, thinking about the planet Earth only, and thus reduced God to a tribal God from the idea of a creator of the universe. So actually made God a whole lot smaller than the biblical tradition claims. So why did I spend so much time with these three ways of distinguishing between time and eternity? Because I think that besides helping our understanding of time and eternity, they also provide a key for dialogue between theology and science. And do that on questions of time, future, and hope, for instance. I think that these three models do not only apply to all theological thinking about these specific questions. In slightly varied forms, these structures actually recur in our ideas of how we think, how we talk, how we teach, how we shape our institutions of teaching and learning, and in religious communities, how we organize churches and theologies, and the interaction between them. Almost everywhere we can find static and hierarchical patterns. We can find patterns whose main concern is to quantify as much as possible. And we can find models of relationality. I think this structure applies in many contexts. And sometimes these three types of reasoning may be able to interact, and they may hold truth all three together. Yet quite often, and I'm afraid more often than we are aware of, we have to make a choice for either the one or the other. And we have to make choices because this is about questions of truth. And I tend to think that truth feels at home in relational categories more than in the others. And finally, what are we going to make of the dilemma that time without a relationship to eternity tends to result in a chronic lack of time, in constant stress? And this is actually a term, chronic or lack of time. Chronicle is made by time itself. Chronos is time in Greek, as you know. So what are we doing with that? Time that has lost its relationship with eternity results in a chronic lack of time and constant stress. My solution would not be to tell the knight to spur his horse and pass right away the royal doorway in Chartres and tell him, if you do that, you will find your peace. We cannot instrumentalize eternity, using it as a kind of drug. In that respect, Karl Marx was right when he called religion the opium of the people. What I'm aiming at is an understanding of eternity as the other of time, respected for its otherness, not instrumentalized, not functionalized, but with the right of challenging and provoking time and our understanding of time. So the solution is not back to Chartres. Nostalgia is seldom a good advisor. Not everything was better in the past. The static and hierarchical traits of the Chartres vision must be carefully examined and criticized before they can be fruitful for a relational understanding of time and eternity. Instead, I want to highlight the eschatological dynamics, because in the very end, it is about hope. Eschatology, the thoughts about the last things, existentially and in terms of time, raises the question of hope in face of cultures that often mask their inherent despair with systems of security or with consumer happiness, which inevitably fail when taken to be ultimate. Of course we need security, but if these systems of security and if these patterns of consumer happiness are taken to be the remedy for the existential despair, then they fail. They can never be ultimate. Also, an eschatology which is called a pie-in-the-sky eschatology. Now, if you have a bad time here, you will have lovely heaven, that kind of things. Or a roast-in-hell eschatology, which tries to sort out who is going there. A pie-in-the-sky eschatology as well as a roast-in-hell eschatology would both be betrayals of divine and human dignity alike, rather driven by the question, what may we hope for? What may we hope for? Eschatology must be dedicated to the reshaping of modern cultures that are in danger of losing life-affirming and life-sustaining traditions and practices. Eschatology is the radical questioning of every system. It has dedicated itself to the incalculable. That's interesting. There is a logic, eschatology, dedicated to the incalculable. Eschatology in this is radically different from science. Science is and must be dedicated to the calculable and to the construction of systems. Eschatology is the permanent crisis of all systems. And that can be said of good theology as well. It's the permanent crisis of all systems. It remains the great exercise in the school of penultimacy, requiring us to acknowledge the primacy of that which is possible, potentiality, and that which is promised. It cannot be deduced from science, but it's not either principally inconsistent with science. So in these circumstances, where we have something that is different from science, but not contradictory to science, we have a situation where the dialogue between science and theology can go on and should go